Hello, can you all hear me? You all are an enthusiastic audience. You're making this easy. You haven't even heard me yet, and you're just clapping. Thank you, Nan, for a wonderful introduction. It's really an honor to be here tonight. Eleanor, thank you. The story of the Heginbothams and Kao Kalia Yang go way far back. For the students here, because I'm a storyteller, I'll tell that story, and then we'll proceed. In 2003, my grandma had just died, and I started writing this long love letter to her that would become the Late Homecomer. But as I was writing, I was on page 36, I think. My dad stopped me. He said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm writing a love letter to Grandma." My father said, "You know, if you dream in the right direction, the dream never dies. It always only grows bigger." And so I started thinking about how maybe the world, as big as the world is, that the world could miss her along with me. This woman who had never learned how to read or write. And so I thought, I have to go to writing school because I was still a victim of the semicolon and other grammatical structures. There was a fellowship called the Paul and Daisy Searles Fellowship for New Americans. And I got it as a freshman. This says something about campus mail. I got it, it was in my mailbox as a freshman, and I grabbed it and I stuck it at the bottom of my books. And so my senior year, I went back to that flyer and I applied overnight. I didn't have a writing portfolio, and I didn't want to submit the story that I'd written for my grandma, so that night I wrote a fresh story. I wrote tribute to a pathological liar, a fictional narrative about a young woman who's writing to her mother, who's a pathological liar. Her mother said, "You know, I sat on a wet toilet, and then you were born 9 months later." That's where I enter that story. And I sent it into the Paul and Daisy Searles Fellowship, knowing that most of their candidates, most of their fellows were from Harvard and Stanford, and they were doing law and medicine. I sent it in, and I promptly forgot about it. I didn't even save a copy for myself because I have this habit whenever I'm at wit's end, I apply to jobs I don't qualify for, like CEO of the Martha Stewart Corporation and other things. So I shot it into the dark, and I forgot about it. About a month later, I received a phone call, and it was from a Stanley Heginbotham from New York City. And he said that he read my story and that my references were no good. He wanted to talk to the people who had written those references because I was competing with people whose reference letters were 3-4 pages long. And mine were half a page and then a page. And so I gave him those phone numbers, and that conversation and the ensuing conversations changed my life. So that was 2003, that was 13 years ago, when I was introduced to the Heginbothams. And then they talked to me about somebody they knew who was in St. Paul, their sister-in-law. Stan talked to his sister-in-law, Dr. Heginbotham here. And I thought, one day maybe I'll meet her, but that's it, that's all. So I went to Columbia University, and I finished the Late Homecomer. I came back here, and I started teaching at Concordia University as an adjunct professor because President Holst then said to me, they were opening the Center for Hmong Studies here at Concordia, and I was a young writer trying to get into my community, so I was working as a journalist for Hmong Today, and I came to cover the event. And President Holst, I think, was impressed with me, so he asked to meet with me. And I went to meet with him, and he said, "Do you think you're a good teacher?" And I said, "I taught at Columbia. You know, I taught professors from NYU and other places, and I think I can teach." And he said, "Do you want a challenge?" And I said, "Yes." And he says, "You're going to have to be a better teacher if you teach at Concordia." And he looked at me, and there was something in the way he was looking at me that I said, "Fine." And so I found myself here in 2005 in an English classroom teaching the fundamentals of English. And I remember telling my students that I was working on a book and that it was going to come out, and it was going to be called The Late Homecomer. And they asked me, "Are you a writer or a teacher?" And I said, "I can't decide yet, but I'm definitely, this book is definitely going to come out in the world." And in 2008, it did. 2008, it did, and since it came out, I've been invited back by Nan, but by other folk as well to visit classrooms here. I've stood at this podium before talking, so this is the second time around, which means I have to be good tonight, because I can't say this is my first time here. But tonight, I want to talk to you about what happens when the books end, about the world within. I'll read to you the very last paragraph from The Late Homecomer. How many of you have read it, just so I have an idea? Some of you. "This year, we tell the Hmong story the way it is, Father. Hold on, our dreams are coming. We didn't come all the way from the clouds just to go back without a trace. We, seekers of refuge, will find it, if not in the world, then in each other. If not in life, then surely in books. Our dreams are coming, grandmother. I am holding on to you as you are holding on to me. Mother, I didn't forget you. My hand is all caught up in yours. Together we are typing on the keyboards of time. We will pick up the same warm breeze, the winds of summer. Our dreams are coming true, my brothers and sisters. In 2008, that's where my book ended. I got married, I fell in love, I got married, I had babies. 2012, my mom, the Great Depression happened. My mom was let go from her job at Wells Fargo, where she was putting mortgage files. There was a mortgage crisis. She was putting mortgage files on the shelves, heavy files. And when she needed shoulder surgery, Wells Fargo gave her job to someone else. My father was working for the largest manufacturer of hard materials in the world. In 2012, they let him go as well because they wanted to have a conversation about each of the Hmong men were being asked to run 4 or 5 machines on the night shift, and everybody else was only running 1 machine. And so one of the older Hmong men, he had carpal tunnel. It was so bad that he couldn't run the 5th machine. And one of the younger men said, "Let me run it for you." Asked the supervisor. The supervisor said, "F you." And they asked to talk to him again, and he said no. And so they were let go. The world that we were walking toward was falling apart. Aaron and I, my husband and I, we were pregnant with our first baby. At 19 weeks, we found in our first ultrasound that the baby had died inside of me. And so we had to deliver the baby because the baby was too big to just come out. All night long, I remember, this is 2012, I remember every time my mother would cry in pain, followed by the cries of a live baby, my husband would cry by my side. And I just stayed there, and I thought, my world is falling apart. But I tried to be nice to people, to say thank you when the nurses asked me if I wanted more and more meds. I tried to be patient because I knew that I was no longer in control. In 2012, I wrote the song Poet. And so my world was falling apart. And I'm gonna read you a little bit about what happens when the world falls apart. This book is for the suns that rise on the horizons we've yet to see, for my brothers and sisters, my sons and daughters, for my father Mbiya, who sings his lonely songs so that we may hear the trembling of the still, fluttering heart. Begins with an epigraph. Gutia is, in the words of Ralph Ellison on American Blues, an impulse to keep the painful details and episodes of a brutal experience alive in one's aching consciousness, to finger its jagged grain and to transcend it, not by the consolation of philosophy, but by squeezing from it a near-tragic, near-cosmic lyricism. As a form, the blues is an autobiographical chronicle of personal catastrophe expressed lyrically. Gutia songs can be duets, the voices of fathers and daughters coming together, different verses within the same song, stanzas in the same poem. My first absolute memory of my father as a poet happened at the Hmong American New Year in November of 1989. Someone had put my father's name down as a performer at the annual celebration. We were in the old Civic Center, now renovated and renamed. The younger kids hadn't been born yet. They were still up high in the clouds in their race across the sky. It was only the 5 of us, my mother, my father, Doug, me, and Sue, our baby brother. My mother pushed Sue in the old stroller we got from a garage sale during the summer. Doug was 10 years old. I was in the last months of my 8th year. It was the first year I was growing out my hair from its Thai schoolgirl bob. And I had borrowed my mother's hairspray and done a tiny poof on the bangs that were getting long over my eyes. My father had not been excited about my decision to let my hair grow out. He thought I was too young, but my mother had agreed that it was time I learned how to take care of long hair, and so my father had relented. I was learning how to be critical of my father that year, our second year in America. My father owned 2 suits, the brown one that Grandma had paid for in Thailand, and then a black one that my mother had chosen for him at Men's Warehouse. He wore the black suit to the Hmong New Year that year, his straight shoulders lifted high in the suit. My father looked like a man who worked in an office building. My mother wore a black sweater with shiny beads, purple pants with seams down the front that she created, carefully with the iron, knee-high stockings that made the skin of her feet dark and smooth, and a pair of heels that clicked gently on the floor with each step she took. When my mother and father walked together, I thought they both looked good enough to be secretaries. The only challenge to the image were the sleeping baby boy in the stroller, Doug and me, and the backdrop of Hmong people in our finery. When we heard Biya, if you hear this, please come to the stage. Your name is being called for the traditional Gutia performance. Biya, please report to the stage. It did not register that they were calling the Biya we knew. It was not until the familiar faces of family, aunts and uncles, second and third cousins, emerged from the crowd and each of them pointed my father toward the stage that we knew our father was being called. My father shook his head. He was like me. He was shy. He did not want to go to the stage. He shook his head slowly again, this time smiling. When old friends and the faces did not disappear, my father looked at my mother and shrugged his shoulders, both his hands raised, palms up. He allowed himself to be pulled toward the sound of the amplified voices calling his name. Near the empty outskirts of the stage where the people had cleared room so that the raised platform seemed a small island in the sea of smooth concrete, my father straightened his spine and walked slowly to the woman and the man waiting for him with the microphone extended. My father's name was announced as a contributor to the New Year's festivities. The people around me applauded. I stood by my mother, my older sister, and my baby brother in the crowd, and we watched my father take the extended microphone from the male host, shake his hand, nod to the female host, and then climb the stairs to the stage. I was nervous for my father. I was also scared that I would be embarrassed by him. I had heard stories of how he had been requested to sing at the Hmong New Year celebrations in Vinai Refugee Camp, but it was not something I could remember. I imagined the dust rising in the yellow dirt field, the young men and women standing opposite each other, my father standing on a makeshift stage, his voice muffled by the debris of our lives in Thailand, struggling to be heard. I knew that my father's singing was valued by the adults. I looked at the faces of the men and the women, standing still, eyes on my father, and I realized that they did not know that I was his daughter. I was just another kid in the crowd of Hmong people, celebrating the new year. The fluorescent bulbs continued to cast their unfriendly light upon us. If I grew embarrassed, I figured I could always pretend I didn't exist. When my father began to sing, I watched him as a stranger would. I saw a man standing still, his left hand holding a microphone, his right smoothing the side of his suit jacket. There was firmness to the set of his jaw, an appearance, a reckoning in his straight stance. The steadiness of my father's voice reached out to me. His niyaye, the preamble to the form, called out across the crowd. He looked at the people from one side of the arena to the other. He trained his gaze high over us at the people sitting in the stands. As he sang, it seemed he saw through the steel beams and the cement walls that surrounded us and out into the world we had ventured from. It was a song of grieving. The song was a cry for a new year that once was a time for rest after the bountiful harvest, for the old to call upon the young, for all to work together toward the future of a sun on the rise. There was a moment of transition, and then my father sang. The flash of light that turned the world dark, the sounds of exploding suns across the sky, the cries that rang forth in the place of laughter. A new quiet entered into the arena. His voice softened, his tones lengthened. Lost are the ones who run through the jungles without shoes, the young screaming for their elders to run faster. A giant moon on the other side of the river, the glittering water, a mirror for what will come. People started weeping. Men and women reached into pockets and purses and came forth with folded pieces of wrinkled napkins. They tore up the napkins to share. Those with nothing in hand began wiping away their tears on their sleeves. I saw my father bend his head, searching within for the words that would send away the sorrow he had unleashed. He walked a few steps forward to the edge of the stage and raised his right hand to the audience, opened his palm, closed it again, slowly dropped his hand, and allowed the fingers to round into fists. My father sang. A brother and sister searched the world for each other, one caught on the side of the trees, the other has traveled far across the wide seas. His rhythm and his rhyme were one. His words grew louder, his voice stronger. He sang. Like the eggs hatched upon the same nest, they huddle to themselves and call out to the same feathery bed. The future takes us to the same place. Our hearts hover close to the same space, where once our mothers and fathers held us close and made us safe. My fear of embarrassment vanished. In its place, there was no pride, just an understanding of the man I had always seen exclusively as mine. Now standing before his people with his heart open, bleeding hardship and hurrying hope. The words had nothing and everything to do with my being in the big arena. There was no room for refusal, for thoughts or ideas. It was all just a moment felt, emotions bubbling forth from the losses the Hmong had endured. In his song, I was no longer young. I was one with a people who had lived for a long time, traveled across many lands, a people clinging to each other for a reminder, a promise of home, that place deep inside and far beyond where the Hmong people had hidden our hearts so that we could heal. There was nothing to be embarrassed about. After my father's song ended, there was a stretch of silence, noses being blown, breath exhaled, and then the echo ring of applause. Men and women rushed toward him at the stage's edge, and they clapped their hands on his back as he walked down to the floor. Some wept on his shoulder. My mother stood aside, just a woman with her children, and we waited patiently for him to make his way toward us. I slipped my hand from my mother's and moved away from my family so that I could see the moment when they met, my mother and my father. I watched how my father approached my mother, my big sister and my baby brother sleeping in his stroller. My father placed both his hands on those smooth hair. He leaned close to my mother and whispered something in her ear. She turned to him and smiled and nodded. And then I watched the smile fade from her face as she started looking for me. In the car home, we were silent. There were words that I wanted to say, but did not know how or why they felt necessary. I didn't tell my father that I finally listened and found meaning in his songs. No longer were the phrases just bits and pieces of a long story floating from the past into my present. I did not say that I was not embarrassed or that I thought he had done a good job. All I did was stare out the car window and hear the work of the wind in the dark, cold night. I squinted hard at the lights in the distance. I urged my world to dissolve into a blur of light circles. Dove sat quietly beside me, lost in her own thoughts. Her new shoes were a small heap on the floor of the car beneath her dangling feet. Sue, our baby brother, slept in his car seat between us. Our brown Subaru made its hiccuping noise at every stoplight, and I watched puffs of smoke balloon behind us when the lights turned from red to green. I could smell the exhaust from our car. I hoped other people weren't able to smell it as I did. I listened to the wind blow hard against the car. I felt the car shake. I did not want to tell my father that his song had shaken my heart, taking me to a place that I did not want to visit for fear I would never return. Now that I had heard, I could not forget the suffering and sorrow of the Hmong story. I wrote my first book after my grandma died, and I wrote this after, I guess technically it's called miscarriage. Baby was 19 weeks. He looked like me. But he weighed like air. He floated away. And I thought I could die. I thought that if I closed my eyes, I could just die right there. After all the hard work I had done trying to push the late homecomer into the world, I could close my eyes and die. But I remember my husband and I were on a walk, and winter was coming. Everything was cold. Everything was dying. And we walked beside this yard, and there was a drying clematis vine. And then we saw that purple flower that bloomed in the bright sunshine. And I remember thinking to myself, why bloom? Winter is coming. There's no more point. And then I started thinking, and I started breathing in my thoughts. And my husband says, you have to write. And so in 2 months, I did the first draft of the song Poet. When we encounter death, to live, we must find life. There is no other way. There is no two ways about it. When I meet despair in the world, I'm hungry for hope. In my journey, I've learned that there is exhaustion of the human body. That's easy to cure. You get a good night's rest. For me, it takes a NyQuil. Tomorrow, the world looks different. Everything's a little green, but it looks different. The exhaustion of the human mind. I talk to the intelligent people in my life. I'm surrounded by them. I talk to the intelligent people in my life. I read good books. I'm surrounded by good books, On the pages, I can be friends with anyone I want. So long as I can find the book, I can be friends. It is the exhaustion of the human heart that we fight. So what you have here before you is a young lady who spent a long day working. I've done 3 classroom presentations today, 2 interviews. It's been a good day. If I died tonight, I would have died knowing I lived a good day. That I gave my all to the world around me, and that the world gave in return. Not only in friendship, not only in ideas, but in heart. I don't have a speech, I never do. But I'm here for you. I know that the Augsburg ladies have traveled to get here. And I know that all of you have also traveled to get here on a beautiful evening, a splendid evening. And so please talk to me. Your questions will dictate the trajectory of the talk. And I always say this because it's true. If you're sitting there and you don't ask me anything at all, and you go out there and you say, man, that talk was boring, I got nothing from it, you're not being a very good person. You're not being a very fair person. You're not being a very just person. And then more importantly, you're not being a very good student, because nobody can be the engine for the learning that we need to do. Okay, nobody can be the engine for the learning that we need to do. So please talk to me. You can ask me anything you want from any direction at all, and I will take it where I want. Yes, right there. An English professor. You know, when I wrote the Late Homecomer, it was a fairly, for me in my brain, the real organizing concept came when I realized the Hmong funeral, what happens, right? When you die and you have a body there, you have a guide that takes the body back to every place you've been. And so I was making 2 big decisions, right? Do I begin at the death of my grandmother and journey back into the past? Or do I begin with the emergence of my consciousness and my grandmother, so you could love her along with me? And I made the decision to begin so that you can love her along with me, so that you can feel my tears at the end. But I wrote the back of the book before I wrote the front. I wrote the back of the book as I was missing my grandmother, as I was saying goodbye to her. It was my way of saying goodbye to her. Because when we first came to America, I learned how to write love letters to my grandma in California. I was confused by the subject, the verb, and the noun. I didn't like all that stuff. I have an older sister, Dao, who loved that stuff, and so I hated it even more. But Grandma lived in California, and we lived in St. Paul, Minnesota, and we couldn't afford long-distance phone calls. And so I started writing to her. And I thought, if I press really hard on the page, then even if my grandma can't read my words, she'll feel my love. And that's what I did. You know, when they went through my grandma's 13 suitcases, because she never had a room of her own, she carried those 13 suitcases from the house of one child to the next. One of them was full of the letters that my sister and I had written my grandma. And some of them she read so many times with her hands so the ink had come off, and all I could see was the imprint that made on the page. My grandma had a single tooth. All of my life with her, she only had a single tooth. And I remember taking down ice cubes with her. Jolly Rancher, she never said no. We gnawed on bones. I thought my grandma was amazing. When she died, my amazing was gone. I was in a world with a mother and a father who worked day and night to pay the bills, and who kept on saying, go to school, so that one day you don't have to do what we do. So one day you can do work that is more important than us. And so I started writing the book just to be with her, just to be close to her. I started as a 22-year-old. It's a young writer's book. But it's an honest book. It's an authentic book. I've read many books by very talented writers. I'm not standing before you because of talent. I'm standing before you because of the force of my honesty, the force of my love. That is the only reason I stand before you. And so I wrote this book, the best book I knew how to write, as urgently as possible, because I felt time moving. The more time went by, the less I remembered my grandma. The more time went by, the less room I thought, the less room in my heart to hold the big world that we belong to. The song poet is, I think, a much more experienced writer's book, more consciously poetic, because I'm living in the world of my father, and he's a poetic man. My father's poetry has shielded us from the poverty of our lives. All of it, all along the way. I remember when we were really cold at 437 East York Avenue, that has now been demolished and completely rebuilt by Habitat for Humanity for a different family coming from Ethiopia, actually. I remember with a single blue flame, its electric heater, we were so cold, and my father used to have us gather close to him with blankets so he could tell stories, so the time would pass, so we wouldn't feel the cold, so we would feel the heat of some awesome sun flying somewhere, flying across the sky, right? The sun wasn't just there, it was flying. My dad. So I had to try my hardest to do justice to his poetry. And then when I wanted to grow as a writer, I knew that in the first book I'd been a young girl telling the story of her grandma and her people. And in that, I told the story of myself. In this book, I wanted my mom's waist. I've held it 1,000 times at least. But how would it feel to be my father holding that same waist at 16, at 26, at 36, at 46, and now 56? How would it feel? And so I took on a different perspective. The book, the organizing principles of a book, creativity is born out of necessity sometimes, but I wanted to do the second album that never happened. In 1982, my father came up with an album of Hmong song poetry, and it was a bestseller in our community. It made $5,000. His goal was that he would make a second album with that. But that year, and I remember this conversation so clearly, I said to Dad, I need a new backpack. Mine is no longer good. I need new colored pencils. Every year they would have us sharpen our old colored pencils and bring it back to school. But that year I told them I needed new ones because if I didn't get new ones, I would be too embarrassed to go to school. And Doe also had cases for her wants and her needs. So my father went to that $5,000. And then the younger kids came along and they too wanted and needed things, and my father went. The second album never happened. And when my grandma died, my dad stopped singing. He said that he stored the songs in his heart. There was a hole. The songs had leaked out. He stopped singing. And then a producer from PBS came to do a special on me, and she looked at my father and she asked him, how does it feel to give birth to a writer when you're one yourself? And my dad looked at her and he said, I can barely write my own name. My daughter writes in English the stories I only wish I could read. I asked my dad how a song poet became, because I knew you had to have, your voice was your only vehicle, so you had to have been born with a beautiful voice. But there were other influences. I read Robert Frost, I read the Middle Eastern poet Rumi. I read Emily Dickinson. And so I asked him, and my father, expecting maybe some big influence, some big literary, poetic influence in his life and in his response. He said, I was a lonely boy. My mother had 9 children. My father died when I was 2. She took to the mountainsides to feed us. There were very few people in my life who said beautiful things to me. As a little boy, I used to go from the house of one neighbor to the next, collecting the beautiful things that people had to say to each other. I would whisper the words to comfort myself. One day the words escaped on a sigh and a song was born. I said, Dad, that's beautiful. Maybe that's the beginning of my next book. He laughed. He said, maybe it's the ending. And I was okay with that, but then he added, nobody wants to read a book about men like me when you read books about men like Barack Obama written by themselves. My dad loves Barack Obama. He doesn't buy books, but he bought Dreams of My Father and The Audacity of Hope for us. On his own volition, he drove to Barnes & Noble and bought those 2 books and said we should read it because maybe he wasn't intelligent enough to teach us how to stand strong in a world. But maybe Barack Obama could. The only 2 books my father has ever bought. But I started thinking most of the world is made up of men like my father. It's built on shoulders of men like him. I saw men like my father on the streets of New York working in the restaurant basements, washing the dishes, preparing the produce. I saw what their hands looked like, cut by the work that they did. My father has incredibly rough hands because most of his life in America, he's been a machinist. Even now, 4 years after the fact, when my father combs my hair back, I flinch because it hurts. And I have to still my face so that he doesn't see the pain of being his daughter. And so I started writing the book, and I wanted it to be the second album. So then that gave me, all of a sudden, it gave me literary freedom. Instead of organizing like a chapter book, I can think of it like songs, like an album. And I don't know very much about music other than country music, because my mom and dad worked in the factories of Minnesota, and there they listened to K102. And they would come home and ask us, what does this song mean? This guy, they love Travis Tritt. This guy, my dad says, his voice, it's almost like Lucia to me. What's going on? And so we used to have to interpret songs for them. And so I never owned an album before, but my husband loves music. So I had this resource that had entered my life who could explain to me how an album worked, how there were liner notes, and how you could, songs could be connected or they couldn't. But the truth is that they had to stand alone. But I knew that as a writer. The Late Homecomer, I made every chapter, and they're strong enough to stand on its own. That if it was taken out of context, if a professor only wanted to teach one chapter, that it would work. And I wanted that same principle to apply because the Late Homecomer lives because of teachers. Here at Concordia University, as so many other schools across the nation, because it's incredibly taught. And so the song poet became. It was the album that my father, the songs that he sung and did not sing because of us. And I've heard my father sing so many times, I can close my eyes and hear him. He talks a lot, my dad, at least to us, at least in our home. And so his voice is like the soundtrack that never ends. And in my moments of foolishness, in my moments of anger, I've told him I've heard enough. But then when the world is all quiet, when your breath is the only thing you hear, and you're looking for hope and you're looking for life, inevitably I fall to the words of my father. He gathered words from other fathers and to hold his heart strong. My father says that for me, he is the father he imagined. At his best and at his worst, he's the father he imagined. I belong to an imaginary father. So many moments I've shared with my dad in my life, nobody believes is real. In the Late Homecomer, I talked about how my father used to carry me to the tops of the trees and say, your father is holding you up to see a bigger world because one day your feet will walk on the horizons your father has never seen. I remember all my workshop mates saying, no, that can't be. It's too beautiful to be true. And I said, I have a photo to prove it. And so in the Late Homecomer, I had to include the photo of my father holding me up in the trees because some of my readers I knew would feel the same way. And the same is true of the song poet. I think my father sees himself very much he sees his life like a story and a song. And so, like many of us, sometimes you react, but inevitably my father is humbled by his reflections of himself and his life and the lessons that he did not learn and he wants to instill. And so the language of the book is very much the language of being my father's daughter. So that is entirely to my father. But it's phenomenally, I think, different from the Late Homecomer. Yeah. You see, you guys don't even have to ask me that many questions. Right there, from a writer.
So I got my MFA writing in Louisville, so a lot of my friends were from the South.
Yes.
And they had a conversation in your community. Some of them identified as Southern writers, and some of them did not like that label of being a Southern writer. They just saw themselves as a writer. I thought that was kind of an interesting conversation. What do you think of that? Do you have a particular identity or?
When oh, lovely. Matt went to get his MFA in Louisville, and a lot of the writers identified as Southern, and others didn't like it. How do I feel about these categories of regional, geographic categories that sometimes writers are placed in, sometimes they choose to place themselves in? When Nan stood up here and talked about Garrison Keillor and Louise Erdrich, my heart filled because Louise Erdrich was the reason why I entered English. My father's always given me poetry. The English heart of it. It was reading Louise Erdrich's Love Medicine, where she said a young girl cried, and her tears fell into a bucket. She wiped the church down. The church wept with her. Language exploded for me. I understood every single word, and those words carried so much emotion. The world exploded. She is not only my favorite Minnesotan author, but one of my favorite authors of all time. I'm incredibly proud to be a Minnesota author, to come from one of the most literary states in the nation. This is a good thing. It's hard to conceive of a better place to be a young writer. We have grants available here, actually achievable, gettable grants. So if there are young writers in the audience, this is a good place. We're home to some of the finest independent publishers in the nation. The Coffee House Press, the home to the Late Homecomer, is right here in Minneapolis. Whenever I go here, people introduce me, like in Iowa, I was just in Iowa, they said, Kao Kalia Yang, the Minnesotan author. And I thought, it's pretty good, that's a pretty good thing to be. And Matt, I'll be very direct, people have called me worse. They have. They've looked at me and where I come from, and they have presumed so much worse. So it's an honor to be called a good thing. There are fights that I fight, that is not one of them. There are too many fights that I have to fight. So I have to be judicious. And so I say, thank you. I'm right here, yes. Are there things that inside my books that have helped me embrace elements of my life and my identity? Yes. I know after I've been, I'm not a disciplined writer. The way my life is structured, I don't have time to write every single day. When I get to the page, it's like an unleashing, and I need at least 2 hours to get it out, and I produce on average about 20 pages. So every chapter that you read from me is pretty much done in one sitting. And I don't edit very much. I rely on my editors to edit me. When you're not a perfectionist, you have to trust other people. And so I trust that once my books are done and they go into the world, they enter other hands, and those perspectives are always good. Even when they're not so great, they're always good for me. And so it's always an education for me. But I know when I read my first draft, if it has the power to move me, to make me laugh, to make me cry, to make me see my life in an entirely different way, to make me understand the lives around me in phenomenally different ways, then what I've written is worth editing. It's worth sharing with somebody else. So each and every single time. I don't publish anything, I don't say no to anything that hasn't somehow positioned me much more clearly in the history and the life that I live. So I just submitted a magazine piece to Into Quarterly because they've looked at different Houston, they've looked at LA, they've looked at New York, now they're looking at Minneapolis, and they're inviting Minneapolis writers, and they've invited me. And so I thought, I have to write something, but I don't have a lot of time. I had 45 minutes, and I decided to focus on 2021, the first house my husband and I shared, and it became an exploration of marriage. I didn't know that fights could be satisfying. He was my first real relationship, and so we had loud fights. We had bad fights, We had fights where both of us were crying, where we're storming from one door to the next. But then we learned. We learned that fighting can be productive. That at the end of a fight, you can look at somebody and respect them more, not hate yourself for the decision that you've made to be with them. That you can look at yourself in the mirror and say, that was a good go. So I know that piece is worth publishing because I actually learned how fighting works in our marriage. I actually learned what it's like to be with someone through so much in a single house. The miscarriage happened at 2021. But we walked out of 2021 with a 2-year-old in our arms and my belly bulging with 2 healthy little boys. It was an exploration of that, and it was a worthwhile one for me. And if it's worthwhile for me, then it has a chance with all of you. And so I sent it to the editor, and she wrote back, and she said, we love it. And so now they're going to edit, and I'm going to say yes to like 99% of the editor's remarks. But always, it has to be productive for the writer, otherwise it stands no chance of being useful for the reader. And I'm not going to ask you to read a book that you're not inspired to read. I'm not going to ask you. I've read too many books that were uninteresting to me, and I know what happens when you're done with that book. It's done. I want my books and my words to linger in your brain, for you to feel the taste of them in your mouth. And so, always, they have to be useful for me. In the back, there are two. So we'll go here and then we'll go here. Yes, you first.
So how do you feel about the growing distance between the Hmong youth and the growing older Hmong generation? So I was born in America, my parents were born in Thailand, and as I grow older, I can see the distance that's between the two generations. One is born with American lifestyle, while one is born with really old-fashioned lifestyle. And both sides don't want to compromise. So what's the path that you can take for a compromise that you can help bridge that gap?
Let me try to do justice to the complexity of your question. No, it's okay. How do I feel about the intergenerational drift in the Hmong culture and among Hmong folk? Those who are born in this country who know Western ways, and those born in the old country who are used to more traditional perspectives. Is that fair? You know, I'll give you one answer, and then I'll give you the other answer. The first one is this. My little sister, Shell, went to a book talk with me once, and I was asked whether I felt bad that there was a loss of language among the young Hmong folk here. And Shell made a squeak, and so everybody turned toward her, and she said, I have an answer for that. And her answer has stuck with me, and it's a very grounding answer. She said, who's to say that Kalia is more Hmong than me? I'm born in America. Kalia was born in Thailand. Mom and dad were born in Laos. Our ancestors came from China. We have Hmong in Germany, Hmong in Canada, Hmong in French Guiana, Hmong all over the world now. Who's to say who's more or less Hmong? I do not want to stand here before you and tell you that you're less Hmong than your mom and dad, or that they're less Hmong than their grandparents. At the same time, it is sad when I meet young folk and they don't speak Hmong anymore. Because I love the language. Because I think it's a beautiful language. It makes me sad. But Shal also said one thing during that moment. She said, if you give us what's the best part of you, who are we if we don't pass it forward? It's about giving the best part. So that's what I try to do in my work. I try to give you the most beautiful Hmong heart of me. And we'll see what you do with it. With that said, I'll say this. My little brother Maxwell is only 12. He's a smart kid, a thoughtful kid. You know, he says to me, he's the only grandchild who my grandma never met, and so Max doesn't know Jolie other than from the Late Homecomer. He sees photos of her, and when he was a little baby, he used to say, Grandma makes my heart strong like Superman. But I saw Superman fall in Andover, Minnesota, because Superman spoke Hmong with a thick accent, because Superman was raised by my mom and my dad primarily. And I saw what happened to Superman when the other kids wouldn't talk to him and they wouldn't play with him on the playground. I saw what happened to him after a particularly hard bus ride when the boy he sat beside, because the bus was full, told him to get up, and Superman crouched all the way home. I see what happens to Superman when he hears white kids saying Nigga, and he says it's wrong, but he doesn't quite know where to position himself in a racial discourse that is extremely black and white. I see Superman suffer. For me, it breaks my heart. My daddy once said to Doug and me, we were arguing about identity, and he goes, he said, identity is what you do when you don't have to look for food. It is a privilege to debate identity. He's right. My mom and dad, your mom and dad, I don't think they have much time to talk about their identities. I think they know that they have to put food on the table for us. And I think their expectation is that we go to school so that one day, our children will not be in the position that we are in. Because we're their 401ks, right? We are their retirement plans. Every poor kid I've ever talked to across the racial spectrum dreams of the day they can buy a house for their mom and dad. That is our dream. Dreams are heavy if you're not dreaming in the right direction. And even when you are, they grow heavy. Nobody told me that education was lonely. Nobody told me that I would be on my own for most of the journey. My Uncle Chu, when he talked about education, he was a teacher in Laos. He always reminded us that we weren't just students in the background. There was a time when we stood in the front of the class too. My Uncle Hu went to college in Vientiane, the capital of Laos, so he always reminded us that we wouldn't be the first ones in college, that it was within our bodies and our bloodline that we were capable of doing that. But none of that meant anything when I was wandering around Columbia University's campus intimidated because everybody else had all the beautiful words, the important messages for the world, and I just felt in myself an inadequacy. There have been many moments, and I speak very much for me, when I felt my mom and dad, especially my father, expected too much of me, and that I wasn't good enough, and I wouldn't be able to deliver. There have been many moments when I've cried to myself because I hear them talking about the overdraft again and again and again, the overdraft fees, and my mom has her head at the table. For all that I am, seeing her with her hands around her head at that table, it brings me home. All of these things, the distance, the perceived distance. I can tell you, when I show my students at Carleton what happens to the Hmong in Laos, trapped in the jungles, they all weep the same tears that I feel on my own face. All of the distance, right? In the documentary, they kept on saying, it is as if those people never walked out of time. It is as if they're trapped in a 1970s war. It didn't matter. My grandma sat by the window and she cut into plastic bags and then she would make them into ropes on her legs though. With a bit of liquid, she would put her hands and run them through the plastic and make ropes. Every time I saw her, every time I saw a plastic bag, I thought about my grandma. I think about her still every time I get bags from Cup Foods. I collect them, as if one day I can give them to my grandma and we can make 1,000 ropes to tie around all of the important things in this world together. Because my grandma said that there are always loose ends in this world that we belong to. I believe that what you feel in those moments of loneliness, it's a call for you to come home. I've learned in my life so far that we don't leave spaces behind. It's all about the return. We return different, and we return to make that space friendlier for those like us. That's what it's about. And so I left my mom and dad to become more educated, and I returned only to realize how much I have to learn from them still. Old-fashioned is not a fair word for your mom and dad. They're an incredibly progressive lot. How else do you remain intact as a people without a country when so many of you have died, that you somehow instill in your children the beauty of life? Bad things happen to some people and they become bad in the process. But for much of the Hmong, I can honestly say from experience, we belong to incredibly traumatized people who dream of a more beautiful world, and they dream us into them. I couldn't look at my dad and tell him that I wasn't the happy ending that he'd been waiting for. I can't look at him and tell him that I'm not the happy ending that he's been waiting for. At the same time, I have a daughter now, and I look at her, and I see in her so much happiness, so much joy, so much beauty, so much complication, right? Because she's not only Hmong now, she's half white. When I die, I'm going to die a Hmong death. I'm going to go back to the house of my ancestors. Dinner is going to be ready, everybody's going to be around, and they'll all say, where have you been? Why have you been waiting so long? Why are you so late in coming home? My daughter can choose now to go to heaven, the world that her grandparents on one side go to, or she can find us in some Hmong mountain in her heart. But that choice is going to present, I think, a much more complicated reality for her than it is for me. Before you. What life is going to teach you, what life continues to teach me, is that it gets harder. My daddy told me a long time ago that I would learn the strength of the human heart, not of its weakness or fragility. Right now, I'm working on a book about a young girl who becomes a healer because she thinks she can combat death. Everybody has died. But she realizes in the process of living that there are things worse than death. I can tell you, a year ago, I died when I delivered my boys. Death is not easy. Death is not hard. Death is pretty easy when it comes. Death is pretty easy when it comes because it's so swift and so sudden. As much as you anticipate death, you don't know when it takes you. It's the coming back to life that's hard. You know? So the reality is, we are growing up in different worlds. We're products of different times, products of different circumstances. We're going to have differences. But we have to look beyond that to the things that shake us and move us to be better than we are. That's the power of belonging. That's the power that I fight for in the world that we belong to. Was that satisfying or no? Yes, I didn't forget.
You're so eloquent. My question feels very mundane, but do you have a process or a schedule with which you write, or do you more respond to things when you write?
Do I have a process when I write? That's a good question. Or am I just a responsive writer? Do I respond to prompts and do that? Before I had kids, I would like to tell you that I like to write near orchids. And I like it when the orchids are in bloom and the sun is hitting them. And so then I think about beautiful things. And I like to start my writing at beautiful points of departure. They're just points of departure, right? But now that I have 1-year-old identical twin boys and a 3-year-old daughter, I write anywhere. I write anywhere and everywhere I can. You know, if I'm not so tired, if my brain is still working, if my heart is still working, that's when I write. I say this because a lot of students ask me, you know, they have a paper due tomorrow and they're working on it that night. You need at least 2 good hours to get over the junk of it all. I upload into my journal, so all the junk goes in my journal. So when I go to my computer, I can write for a bigger audience, a bigger world. I can write more selflessly and more generously. So that's what I do. I upload junk into my diaries, and I write it in a handwriting that nobody can read. Because my concerns at the end of the day are so mediocre. Because my diaries are just a collection of my hopes and my dreams and my wishes. And when I write to reckon with reality. And so if something horrible happens, I'll write about it in the moment, and then I'll write about it 3 months down the line. Because how we feel is how we communicate on the page. It's not just all up here, it's not just brain work, it's heart work as well. Especially if you do the kind of writing that I do. And heart work is hard work. So whenever I have energy and time, I do it then. I don't even water my orchids these days. My husband has to ice cube them so they can bloom for me. You know? It's been that kind of a journey and that kind of a process for me. But I write to find equilibrium. If I don't write, I lose it. If I don't write, the world is too heavy and I can't carry it. Because bad things happen all the time. Bad things happen every day. And they can never just roll down my back. I can never just disregard them. I feel them keenly. And I feel them like blows. Like the death of Philando Castile was really hard for me because my nephews go to J.J. Hill, because my daughter Shenyang hates milk, and Lali Kik, my nephew, knows this, but she loves everything from school, so he saved his milk cartons for her every day during lunch. And when Mr. Philando noticed this, he gave Lali an extra carton of milk so he could drink it. And when Philando died, I looked at Shenyang, and I looked at Lali, and I looked at myself, and I looked at my brother. It was hard. For 3 weeks, I couldn't write. I couldn't write because the world was so heavy. And then I knew I was breaking apart, and so I journaled. I journaled like 13 pages. And after that, I was able to begin to articulate. This is also another point, because you're writing a writerly question. There are no wasted pages when you're a writer. Because how many of what we say, how much of where we stand in the world first came out in those unpublished pages? People say to me all the time, oh, you're so articulate, or you can answer questions so well. They don't know how many pages I've thrown away. They don't know how many questions I've tangled with in my head and in my heart. You know, they may never make it out into the world in words. But my daddy says when we speak, we write on the fabric of the human being. It's a different medium. And so right now, I'm writing on you. That's how I think about it, and that's how I execute. That's how it has to work. Which is why I never have a draft of a speech to work from. Because I'm not interested in writing a blank check. I want your name on it. And that's the same way I go to the page, with the same passion. Right here, yes. So people, when the first book came out, I visited over 1,000 book groups. Over 1,000 book groups. And after every meeting, they would say, "You're just like your writing." You're just like your writing. Today, this morning, I visited a classroom at Carleton, my alma mater, but it wasn't my classroom. I visited, and the students asked me the exact same question. And the truth is, I don't know what else to do. Every time I meet somebody, every time I am confronted with life, I give it my all. My grandma said that life is nothing more than moments strong on the thread of time, that if you give your all to one moment, you open up the possibility for the next. That is it, and that is all. When I meet people, I give it my all. When I go on the page, I give it my all. I don't hold anything back. I don't reserve anything back, because I don't want to be that kind of a person. I don't want to be that kind of human being. If I died today, I died giving my all. I died giving you the best of everything I have to deliver right here and right now. And so that's how I am on the page. And that's how I am when I meet people too. But when I meet people, I get to ask them tons of questions. And so that's what I do. Because they know so much about me already, I will, if you don't check me, I'll just level the questions. Because I'm curious and I want to know about you and the way you read the world. But it is a compliment to say that a writer is like his or her books, because they wouldn't be there before you if not for those books. Right? A lot of them wouldn't. And not every writer is a public speaker. Not every writer is a teacher. But every good writer is a true artist. And we build. We build relationships. More than anything else, we build relationships. That's the only way you can survive as an artist anyway. People have to like you, they have to love you, they have to push you up and you rise. Because nobody pays you money for that book that you haven't written. Not really. Not when you're starting out. Not when you're starting out from a place like me. Nobody cares what my next great sentence is. It doesn't work that way. But I build relationships. And so when they meet me, it's a great thing that they're interested and engaged and that they want to meet me somewhere. It's an opportunity. I love to fish. I never catch fish, but I love to fish because I love the possibility. And when I meet people, it's like that. There's always bait on my line, and my line is always in the water. Right? You're going to take that, even if you're going to nibble, you allow me an opportunity to play. That's how I see it. Hard work has to be fun work, otherwise you don't do good work. Right here.
Your book is, I teach at a high school not too far from here. Your book is very popular at our school, which is tremendous for obvious reasons. Maybe a simple question, but as a person who, I would say, also wrote history too, if you were to talk to a group of high school students about your story or the story of Hmong people, if you could encapsulate the things that are most important, what would you share?
There's so many ways. Oh, yeah, I have to repeat the questions. Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Nan. So I have no idea what time it is, but this is what I'll say. You're giving me pretty much candy. I can take your question anywhere, right? When I stand in front of an audience, what I want them to do, no matter how old or how young they are, I want them to see a beating Hmong heart there before them. I throw my heart out there. That's a Hmong heart. Many places I go, Hmong people have never been, and oftentimes, my audience's first introduction to the Hmong story and to the Hmong people. And they're always surprised. And I wonder why. I wonder what they think about Hmongness, who they think we are, that they're always so impressed is the word they use. I tell them that the Hmong people are impressive. I say we're an impressive lot. That's it, that's all. Right here. Ellie, and then we'll close up.
You spoke about possibilities. I love your story, the fishing possibilities. You have raised up your story and the stories of other people so beautifully. And now we have, and that's a story that bears so much talking about.
Thank you, Ellie. We live in a world that is creating more and more refugees all the time. I'm only now at 35 realizing how much everybody, all the adults in my family, how they suffer from post-traumatic war syndrome. It's why my dad's hand shakes at the dining table after he has a nightmare. It's why my mom is chased by the North Vietnamese army night in and night out, no matter where we're sleeping or who she's sleeping by. The Karen population came. They're a lot like the Hmong. They've been in the refugee camps far longer than the Hmong have been. The number one thing that all of the young boys tell me when I go to visit the public schools is that they want to die. It's not a secret. They say we want to die. You cannot change what people want. You can only shift their focus so that the world becomes larger, so that they can see how willing you are. My grandma says that every time we have the opportunity to help, we have the power to hurt. I think about that often. I think about the Hmong experience, how when we came here, everybody wanted to teach us so much, and we forgot for so long that we had things to offer the world in return, that we had things to teach America as well. I can honestly tell you that in the work that I do, I meet refugees every day from around the world. Inevitably, the young ones, the ones in school, ask me, how do we tell our stories too? Inevitably. And all I can do is lead by example. When I was a young girl burning to go to college, I was in this program called the Minority Encouragement Program from the St. Paul Public Schools, and they would take us to leadership trainings once in a while, and the question was always, what is a leader? And I thought about it for years, and then finally I just decided that a leader was somebody who lived a life that others would willingly and voluntarily follow. That's what I try to do, Ellie, with the young ones. So they write me more emails than I can respond to. The young men in jail write me letters, and I don't. I have one hanging out. It's been sitting by our fruit bowl for months now because I didn't want to put the prisoner numbers on the letter that I mail back. And if you don't identify somebody by those numbers, if you only identify them by names, the guards return those letters to you. There are so many places and spaces where we can help, and so many places and people we can hurt. And so every day, including with the Syrians, I try to live a life where the young ones can see that there is room for them to teach the hard lessons that they've learned to a world that cares. I think that is the hardest part, that the world cares. Because it's easy to forget, it's easy to believe that you don't matter. It's easy to say, we're not in history correctly, so we don't belong in it. But that's what I try to do. So I try to model what it is like to begin to express, to begin to heal, because the hurting is so hard. But yeah, I have no good answers when the boys tell me they want to kill themselves. And sometimes part of helping is just hearing it and letting it sink. Letting them see that you have no words to take away the hurt that they're in. That words cannot build homes alone. That it takes hope born inside deep. So that's all I do. I listen. And I go into the world and I listen some more. Because as important as it is to speak, we have to tune up the volume of our listening. I will end here. Each and every single one of us has a world within. And until other people listen, those worlds die a little bit more each day. You don't have to be a writer. You don't have to be an artist to listen. You don't have to have the right words to respond. The human heart expresses itself in the places where there is no language. How else do I say, how else do I stand here before you? My mom and dad call me Vinai, and my grandma calls me Vinai. There is no English equivalent. And no language on earth that could get to the heart of what they mean when they call me Vinai. Thank you so much.